All right, thanks everybody for joining today's CISL seminar. We're very pleased today to have Arika Virapongse, who's a community engagement specialist who works primarily with science and academic initiatives. Her domain expertise is in the earth sciences, human environment, and conservation and development. As the founder and principal consultant of Path EcoSolutions, she has worked with nonprofits, federally funded research projects, and businesses to help them develop community engagement programs. So we're very pleased to have you here today, Arika. And the title of her talk today is Build It and They Will Come, Community Engagement for Earth Science Data Initiatives. And there might be also some discussion on open software and open communities of practice. So thanks again for joining us today.
All right, thank you very much. And I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me here and also John Klein here for nominating me for this presentation. It's pretty exciting for me to be here because I've lived down the street from NCAR, but I don't think I've actually ever done anything formal here. I've lived here for over 10 years, so this is really fun for me to be here. And if you want to, I understand there might be some people who are online. I was first just going to get a read of who is, if you all are working with community engagement in your projects. If you don't mind, I know if you don't mind just raising your hand, do you work with community engagement? Yes, in earth science, sort of data-ish types of things. Yeah, I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay. Okay, great. So then I just want to just make sure that we're all on the same page as what we'll be talking about. And in this presentation, I'm going to really try to specifically talk about this context because I think it is a very specific context for community engagement. And one of the things I think that is really challenging for people who are working with community engagement is often how vague it is. It can feel like there's a lot of moving parts. You don't know where to start. You've got stakeholders, you've got like platforms. What do you do? How can you break that down? So this is what I'd like to try to accomplish in this presentation is to really find a way so we can think about this in more of a structured way. So think about it in these different pieces. And then also try to come up with some action items, some specific things. Just here's a couple of things you could walk away with from this presentation that you could go and do. So we'll try to, I'll present some information about to help us just understand community engagement, and then also we'll identify some of these useful strategies. I'll talk a little bit about me just because I think it's always important to hear the perspective of like where is this coming from, and then what and why community engagement. Then we'll talk specifically about earth science data initiatives, and then we'll talk about these different specific components. So I'm showing all these pictures here because I would say like I'm a scientist. I've been trained as a scientist, and most of my career I have worked with the community aspects of working with natural resources. And so natural resources, I think of those as shared resources, which I think is relevant to data and to earth science and the type of science products that we create. And I've just really, I've always thought about how is this information that we're doing, how is this going to be impactful for the people we're working with? I worked mostly with subsistence-based communities, and I did that within the context of conservation development. I was always looking at how the human environment interface, how people were impacted by their environment and then vice versa. And then since coming to Boulder, I've kind of segued into more of the virtual environment. And what I did is I took there's been some really great practices, best practices and learnings that have been done in the development field, and I've kind of transferred that over into this virtual environment. I was amazed that it was all theoretical initially, and then I was like, oh, this is actually working really well. So I think there's a lot of really great parallels. But I think community engagement can be done in lots of different ways, and this is the perspective that I bring to it. And then currently I'm working with, these are two groups I'm working with now. So OpenDAP that you guys have probably, I guess I'm in the wrong spot. OpenDAP that you guys probably some of you are familiar with. Can't get the pointer to show. All right, OpenDAP. Okay, and then Cooler at the bottom. So OpenDAP is mostly a virtual, they're a distributed organization. They work with people all around the world. And then Cooler is in contrast, this is an NSF-funded project in the geosciences, just started it last year. It is place-based, so it's in Greeley, out of Greeley, University of Northern Colorado. It's all around climate action, and it's about connecting scientists and academics with the public, the broader community in Greeley. And I just want to mention that because an OpenDAP, if you're not familiar with OpenDAP, is an open source science platform for accessing data. And I'm just trying to show these two different, and then I also worked with the Ronan Institute for 3 years, and that is like an academic institute, basically, that is all of global scholars. And I just want to just mention those specifically because you can see kind of the diversity of the ways that, the ways that I've been working with community engagement and all these different groups, but they're all still really similar. So I'm trying to bring together all these learnings in this presentation. So first of all, I just want to think about first, what is a community? So people, if you've written proposals or you've written, just talked about communities, often people will say community pretty often, but they often mean different things when they're saying it. Usually what they mean is they mean like community, maybe our community that's close to us, the broader community. Often I think when scientists talk about the community, they're talking about this bigger, broader community. But what all communities have, what makes a community is it's usually a group of people that have some sort of shared commonality. So you can imagine it's like people who have training in earth sciences, for example. And then they often have some sort of shared goal. So my example here is having a healthy earth that we can all live on. And then together they have a purpose. So they're like, we are all together because we want to do this thing. And maybe it's we are working together to improve the use and access of earth science data. So in addition to doing this, like this is kind of like, this is our feeling, this is our purpose, but they also do things together. So without doing things, they're not really a community. So for example, in this example, they might organize conferences, write co-authored papers. So they do things together as a group, and that's what makes people feel like they're part of a community. And so these are also, if you look at a community, whether it's whether it's a town like the city of Boulder, whether it's a small subsistence-based community or a globally distributed community, they will often have these five parts here. So you'll often see governance. So there's some sort of decision-making, policies, documentation. There's communication. Communication is usually done internally and externally. And when I mention this, I don't mean that people are just talking to each other. It's usually that there is a mode and there's a way that everybody knows how to communicate. So whether or not you expect an email from Tasia, or you are, expect to come to a seminar and hear from other people, there's usually a kind of a more of a structured way to do that. Events is a scheduled activity. It's when there's a time and place where you're going to get together, like a seminar like this. And participation, what I mean here by participation is that there's a way that people know they belong to the community. So what is it that makes someone part of that community? Is it that they moved to the neighborhood? Is it that they became employed at this organization? And then there's a way for people to become leaders, and there's a way for people to contribute things. And then there's infrastructure. I should have included here, there's also physical infrastructure like a building. That's the way we often think about, like a place-based community, but there's also in the virtual world, there's platforms. So if there's a Slack workspace, if there is a Facebook group, it's a place there where your community kind of talks to each other, meets each other, and that's how people are part of your community. So now moving on to community engagement. So we know what communities are. What's community engagement? This growth activation, a community activation growth pyramid here is just something I've come up with. It is something that this is the way I typically think about community engagement. And when I do work with groups, this is in my mind, I'm thinking about this. If you're doing any sort of, and I'm calling it kind of generally community engagement, but I am actually thinking about these three different things. But that's because all groups, if they're engaging with communities, they're typically doing at least this bottom piece here. So this community engagement piece at the bottom in green. So community engagement is the development of mutually beneficial relationships between an organization or a project, so whoever those core leaders are, and then these target external groups, so that it's like your group, and you're trying to interact with people who are around you. And community engagement is often this kind of one-way thing where you are trying to engage with this group. If you move up the ladder, so if you're in the right context, I'm not saying that every group needs to get to this, this top level of community mobilization, but if your community starts coalescing and they start interacting with each other, then that's when you get community building. So you might get, for example, here at NCAR, people are going to have lunch. They're sitting down, they're talking to each other. That's the community building piece, when people are starting to form those relationships. When you get to community mobilization, that is when a community begins to take leadership and decisions around the goals of whatever the project is. It's not appropriate for every group, but if that is something you want to do in your project, I think for me, communities, I think about, why I do community engagement is because I think it's a way to really help broader society and just people be able to self-determine what they want to be. So it's kind of a way to just empower us around us and also just impact society or benefit the world in the way that we as people want to. So I'm generally kind of aiming. So if we're only doing community engagement, I'll still kind of lean towards that kind of community engagement piece. So here's some examples of community engagement in science. I pulled out some things that it's some things that I'm at least somewhat related to. So I pulled this off the NCAR website for community. This is an example of community around science. Oh, what am I doing? So if you think about like a community, so I always, I think about like you have a project and you kind of think about it like there's a core center and then there's kind of people orbiting around your project. And so there's you in the center, and on the very periphery, there's the community. So there's the public, basically. And so you might be engaging at that level. Then there's community within science. And so I have an example here of the Open Data booth that we just did at the AGU conference in December. And so that is where we were talking to other scientists, and with the hope, so if you think about community and science, the community engagement, it's kind of in that green piece. So that's community around science. If you're thinking more around this community built outside of a project, but still within science, you're probably looking at this kind of orange to green space where it's like you're engaging with people, but you're hoping that there is going to be some community building happening. Maybe they're going to take some of your code and they're going to use it to do something else, and they'll get engaged at a much deeper level. And then there's within a project. So this is an example of the EarthCube meeting from 2022. If you guys know anything, you guys are probably familiar with the NSF EarthCube program to some degree, right? And so that was where this vision that people would get together and they would, this earth science community would get together, data community would get together, and they would take charge. They came up with a governance approach. They made decisions. They decided which projects they wanted. So they really got involved at that level. And so that's a really great example of community mobilization. All right, I'm going to just pause here before I move on to this. Does anybody have any questions? Happy to clarify anything. Okay, so if not, I'm going to move on to this project here. So this is a project that was commissioned by the EarthCube project as they were kind of wrapping down, was commissioned by the EarthCube office. And it was around this idea of what makes earth science data infrastructure projects sustainable? And me with my co-authors, so there's James Gallagher and Basil Tikoff, and also with a much larger team of other people who you guys would probably know within the earth science data community. We chose these 11 different projects and we interviewed leaders or previous leaders of these different groups. And one thing that for me, working with community engagement that came out for me is that it was really clear about how important community was for all of these different groups, but it also differed in terms of how they engaged communities. One other finding that we had was that there were these different data project types, and so we named them as database projects, middleware projects, and framework projects. It was because otherwise we were kind of comparing apples and oranges as we thought about these different groups. And so, you guys are probably familiar with these types of projects too, but so you can imagine like database projects, they're pretty heavily reliant on a disciplinary community that, for example, is contributing data sets. So they're doing a community building in that sense where they are trying to, kind of convince people to deposit their data sets, to follow standards, and then, asking people to use them too. So there's a pretty big community component there. Middleware projects often behave like software companies. And so often the way they interact with communities is that they talk about their community as being users. So there's our users and who's using it, and they're learning about user needs. Framework projects to me are kind of like community projects. This is like OGC, this is ESIP. These are groups that are focused on developing best practices. They're bringing together groups and they're trying to basically facilitate those relationships. This is basically going into a little bit more depth about how these different projects differ and then also how they interact with community. I pulled up my two little diagrams here just to try to show you how we can think about these groups as a community, and then also if you think about them in this kind of community activation, what are their goals within community. So for example, database projects, they are looking for people to contribute to the project often. I'm generalizing here, but they're often focused on coordinating these contributions. And I would say a lot of times that they are really focused on these three pieces here. So there's communication, participation, and infrastructure, where maybe they're trying to communicate with people, with scientists, domain area experts, and then try to help them like participate and become sort of members of the database. And then they have a pretty good platform, so they got this infrastructure. Middleware projects are not overly concerned with all pieces. Like they wouldn't typically be doing governance, not so much. They would typically be focused more on the communication, the infrastructure piece. So it might be like infrastructure like GitHub. So let's communicate. Here's how you contribute, and you can come and interact with us on GitHub. And then there's framework projects. And so in my mind, I'm thinking of a place like ESIP. ESIP in my mind is just like this, the way they do community is amazing. They've got these clusters that are demonstrating the way that community mobilization works. Clusters come up with their own projects. They're achieving things together. So they really are doing all of these pieces of a community.
So what's the infrastructure then? Because we had some discussion on frameworks, but was more on the software side. Thank you. Sorry. So what's the difference, or so we talked about software frameworks and kind of how do we engage the community to kind of come together around that. So where's the difference there between middleware, because there's infrastructure in all those components, right? And there's communication there between middleware and the framework project, but you have the governance and events there. I'm still a little unclear how to draw the lines there.
But between the different types of
middleware and framework especially.
Okay, yeah. So it's definitely a little bit of a gray area. But I would say, so if you're talking about especially with like open science types of initiatives, which there is a really big community component. I think this is where software or middleware projects are very much aligned with community engagement, because you're trying to engage people to come and participate in the development of some kind of software sometimes. The difference I would say is like with middleware projects, it's often there is much more of a centralized leadership. And when I mean centralized, it's kind of centralized within a project. So, for example, let's take OpenDAP as an example. OpenDAP, they've got 5 core kind of software engineers. They're all working together. And their community engagement is much more. They're working on developing their product. They might be engaging with other developers who are around their project, but they're really leading the way. With framework projects, often there's a facilitation aspect. They're not there to really determine what people. They might, to some degree, to say, okay, we're going to focus on this area. Like we're doing this is the year of open science, but they're not really going to decide and push forward a specific project. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's definitely a bit of a gray area.
I think it answers it. And from my perspective, when we yesterday talked about frameworks, this was really more a middleware activity versus a framework activity. So.
Yeah, and it's just probably that's the way we decided to name it. So yeah, so maybe I think frameworks in your context might be a little bit different. In this case, we're thinking of like OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium, and then ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partners. Thank you for that question. Okay, so here's where I'm going to ask you guys a question. So how is engagement a part of your project? For those of you online, you feel free to chat and describe that. If you just want to just think about it, that's fine. I'd love to hear from people because I would also like to learn how community engagement is part of your project. It sounds like you guys all know each other. So I was going to ask you to talk to each other about community engagement. So if that's something, I mean, if you feel comfortable doing that, that'd be great. Or you could just call out and just tell me, like, what do you guys do with community engagement? If you give me a couple of examples. Sure.
So
Sean.
Talk about maybe some of our community software products that are developed primarily at NCAR for the benefit of the broader community. So much of the engagement is around outreach, education, informing our target user communities of directions we're going, and trying, more than anything else, trying to get their input into prioritization, into identifying new capabilities. So I think that's where much of the community aspects come in for things like our software projects.
Mhm. Great. Thank you.
I'd say for new initiatives, it's kind of similar to trying to gather requirements, invite people into the process, which typically is workshops, town halls, those types of things. But I'd say it fits into what what I'm talking about anyway, fits into the scientific community, not the community in the circle outside of science. I think there's some other engagement that might go into that as well. So then there's a number of responses coming up on Slido.
No, I think it's okay. I'll pull out some things here. I'm just kind of browsing through them. So I'm seeing GitHub tickets. That was one that I think is I was thinking of in terms of the middleware projects, connecting with other projects, tutorials, hackathons, gathering software needs, project needs, education initiatives, publicizing resources. It's using GitHub, professional forums, scholarly communication, peer review, workshops and conferences. There's a software engineering assembly, building communities of practice around specific topics, tutorials, one-on-one meetings with users, and workshops. Awesome, thank you. Looks like we've got another response. Communities of practice, yes. Yes, great. That's wonderful. Thank you guys for all sharing that. That is really those are all wonderful pieces of community engagement. And I just want to add here too that one thing that you'll see in community engagement too is like I think about this sort of centralized and decentralized type of community engagement. Centralized community engagement is something that you do as a project. So you're kind of pushing forward things like we're hosting a workshop. We are running these tutorials. And so it's things that you are doing. But then there's decentralized ways that you can do things as well, where maybe you attend somebody's event or you attend somebody else's, their workshops. So there's ways where, and this is, speaking to, I think, the partnerships that we have with the groups around us. It's kind of like we're all part of this big ecosystem. You don't need to just work by yourself. You can work and rely on these other partners and leverage each other's events and activities so that we can, just use all this shared resource. And then in particular, and we see a lot of that here in how, for example, using third-party sites, using GitHub, for example, other platforms have been developed to help us do our community engagement. So we can leverage those different types of infrastructure to do the community engagement we need. So when you're using all these different ways of engaging community, it's often like, what is our goal and what is it that we want to achieve by doing that particular thing? Okay, great, thank you, Tasia. And thank you everybody for contributing. So I'm gonna go through some of these. So this is a part of the presentation where, and I want to leave like 15 minutes or so to just get to, to have some time for discussion and questions. But here's some specific actions, and these are all related to the pieces, the components of a community. And so I'm just going to go through some of these. There's a lot of information on the slide deck, which is also because I did that intentionally. So if you want to go back and look at it, you can. I won't try to get bogged down in the details. But so we'll go through some of these actions, and then hopefully some of them are things that you guys might feel like, oh, maybe I could try that one. So I tried to kind of make these very bite-sized. But so get to know your audience. This is something we often talk about. It's like, get to know your users, get to know them, and know what they want, what their needs are. I put an example here of a database for soil science, for soil samples. And basically, you need to figure out which audience groups do you want to target. It's not one. It's usually you can break them down into smaller groups. So what audience groups do you want to target? And specifically, what do you want each of them to do? Because they're all going to be motivated differently. And so if you want to motivate them, what do you need to know about your audience? And how are you going to figure that out? So here's a try this. Here's something you could try. So I really like this emergent learning approach, if you've ever come across that. To me, it's kind of like the scientific method, but in a less like formal way. And it's basically you have a hypothesis maybe about your users. You think, oh, I think our users are like this. I think this is the way they'd like to use our platform. And then you look for an opportunity. So you know you're going to the AGU conference. Let's go to the AGU conference. I'm just going to talk to people. I'm going to walk the posters, and I'm going to ask them these questions. So you might ask them, hey, have you ever heard of our database? Oh, you work with soils? Have you ever heard of our database? And then what kind of data do you work with? And just write down their responses, write down some basic demographics, like they're a postdoc or they're from India, and then look for patterns in the responses. So you're kind of just taking notes. And then importantly, so that's in the data, collecting the data and the stories, but importantly, talk about the results. So you come back to your project team and carve out some time to just talk about it. What did you learn about talking to your users? And with that, if you can do that at any time that you go into a space where you think your audience is, you should be able to increase your learning around what it is that they need and how your project might fit in with the audience that you're trying to target. So lean on your partners. So I put up an example here of OpenDAP. And these are some of the partners around them. And so you can think about like which organizations are addressing the same audience groups that you are targeting. So, and then also what are ways that you can get to know your audience through them. So all of these groups, for example, they are all organizing their own communities. They do events, they do hackathons, they do different things. So, why would OpenDAP need to do their own events? Or maybe they do because they find that like, oh, we can offer something unique. But, if Pangeo's doing the same thing or doing something similar, then you could just go to Pangeo too. And the other thing you're looking for here is how do these organizations work with their audiences? What's important there is, and I'll talk about a little bit further down another slide, but what you're trying to do is every audience has expectations of how they want to be communicated with and what type of platforms they're on. So if they're using GitHub or they are using Slack, you probably don't want to use, an obscure other platform. Use what they're using because then that's easy for them to just jump on board. So what you can do is you can go to a partner's website, look to see, hey, Pangeo, when's your next community meeting? Go join a meeting. Listen, try to understand what that community feels like. What's the audience like? Where are they from? Which organizations are they from? And if they don't have anything on their website, you can just reach out to an organizer. Almost every group has a community manager. They might call themselves something different, but there is somebody there who is doing the management. And that's often what I'll do is I'll try to figure out like who is the one who organizes the events? Who's the one who comes up with the schedule and talks to people? Even if it's just like a PI project, there's often one person who is doing the bulk of that. And then when you go to an event, introduce yourself, share your project. You're trying to find, are people in this community, can they benefit from my project? Is this a good fit for this audience? And then that might be a group you want to partner with. And then you could also participate further, like give presentations. And basically you're just trying to like become a part of their community. And that's kind of this listening and learning piece where, you don't want to just sort of build your own thing. You want to build off of what already exists out there in your broader community. So support communication. This is thinking about this kind of one-directional. What do you want people to know about you? And it's not just like this marketing thing. It is also trying to share some learnings. I think it's what valuable thing do you have to offer? So when you're communicating, try to figure out what is it that you feel like other people need to know about you. And then also this piece is harder. How can you help people interact with each other? And this is the place where projects don't often get to, and this is kind of the community building piece. It is, versus the community engagement. I would say community engagement is kind of the top one. What do you want people to know about you? Community building is how do you help people interact with you? That can be harder. If you're just sending out newsletters, it's like there's no way for people to talk to. They don't even know who else is in the community. So that is where you might want to have like a social network, which I've termed there as a Slack, a Discord, a discourse, which is a forum. People can get to know who else is in this community. Am I the only one in this community, or are there other people here? And then so email lists. So this is kind of like that one directional. A website is also very one directional. Social media is sort of the middle ground. People could comment on something on LinkedIn, so they can kind of see who's in the community. And then don't discount these mobile phone chats. and especially in other countries, especially developing countries, they love to use WhatsApp, Telegram, things like that. And oftentimes that's where a lot of community organizing happens, is on those apps. And that's a really good example of like, aim to integrate the technologies that people are already using. If they're all on WhatsApp, that's where you want to be. So try this. This is a very simple thing. I know everyone's like, oh, I don't want be on another mailing list. It's true. But at the same time, if somebody really wants to know about you, they want to be on your mail. They want to hear what you're doing. I want the latest update on your organization. And I think this bottom piece here is like a key piece of this. It's collecting people is one of the first steps for creating critical mass around your project. If you don't know who's interested in your project, and you don't even give a way for people to communicate with you and stay in touch with you, like sometimes LinkedIn, I'll use LinkedIn this way. I'll say, oh, you want to, reach out to me on LinkedIn. And then it's kind of like, this is how we can stay in touch. So find one way for them to connect with you. So you could, start a mailing list when you have an event. You could, you could collect email addresses. You could have people register. And then every now and then, send out a message. You usually don't want to do just an email blast, because you need to have one way for people to unsubscribe from things, for example. But basically, I think the basic concept here is just have one way to make sure that anyone who's interested in your project has a way to actually stay connected to your project, besides saying, oh, go take a look at my website. Like, that's not enough. Okay, so encourage participation. This is the place where most groups are really, everyone's like, how can I increase participation? How can I get people more involved? So here's some little tips here. Low barrier to entry. Make it really easy for people to do stuff. So for example, minimize sign-in, that sort of thing. And for example, I like to do like office hours. I'm a real fan of office hours, and that's just like once a week. I am here. If no one's there, it's fine. I'm here. Just show up, and there's someone here from our project who can talk to you. Immediate results. Usually people, when they participate, they want to know that they want to see the results of something they've done. I don't know how many of you have gone to a workshop. You go to a workshop, you participate for 2 days, and then you never hear from them again, and nothing has ever come out of it. People want to see that I've gone to this workshop, and this is what has happened. I have contributed something, and you see it in a report, for example, or a publication, even better. Community-oriented, offer ways for participants to interact with others without you there. So that's a test you can do. If you can step out of it and people are still talking to each other, then you're doing something good. People are connecting, and that's a real great output of your project. Keeping it simple, thinking back to our audiences, we've got our sub-audiences. For each one of those audiences, we basically want them to do one thing. What is the one thing we want them to do? Don't try to make them do a lot of things and have lots of different ways to engage. Just say, just do this. And it just keeps things simple in people's mind. Be mission-driven, so make it possible for people to see how they're impacting the mission. If your mission is to make data more accessible, it makes people feel like when they are contributing to that mission, because that's what drives people to volunteer to things and do things voluntarily, is they want to feel like it aligns with their values. And then value each person. As your community grows, it's easy to lose sight of the individuals. You start to just think of them as, you send out mass emails, you send out newsletters, you don't meet people and you don't answer them like as a person. So for example, one thing I'll do is I'll take time if there's a lot of, if I'm managing a community, I will try to carve out some time. If people took the time to write me an email, I'll take time to really make sure hi, John, like, thank you for writing to me. Answer the question, besides writing little short, emails that make people feel like they're not being heard, essentially. All right. Okay, so decision-making and governance, I think this is the last little tip here. And this is one that is not a good fit for, you'd have to have, this is a better fit for communities that are at a much larger scale. It's often ones that are a little bit more developed. It often takes, especially thinking back to that study that we did, it often takes years for a governance approach to emerge from a community. So it's okay if you don't have something right away. The thing that's important to remember here is that if you don't articulate a way that decisions are made and the way that a community is governed, it usually begins to happen for you. So as humans, we're kind of structuring the world around us, and we come up with rules. And if we don't articulate what the rules are so that everybody knows what they are, they usually become known by just a few people. And that's where it creates these different these power differentials within a community that you really don't. Most people don't. You don't want to be a part of a community and then feel like there's a couple people making all the decisions and you have no say in the community. But to think about what your decision making is going to look like, you really need to think about what's your size, what's your culture, and what are your values. I put an example here from the Wondering School, and this is sort of a clustering sort of decision making of where these different little clusters that are making decisions. And usually you have multiple ways to make decisions. There's decisions that are made by a couple people, the easy decisions, and then there's the bigger decisions that impact the entire community. And then this is where you often want to have other people there to weigh in, because then otherwise it just feels like you're just being led around. And so I just put up a table here of some different types of governance approaches. Personally, I think with a community, I usually will sort of pick and choose from these different approaches that exist already and pull out pieces. Some groups have some really, I was trying to think of this example that I ran across and I couldn't find it, but have come up with really detailed approaches to like how they do their decision making. And it's pretty incredible to see what, the kind of like flat hierarchies, these really like progressive ways of governing communities. And especially within the open science community, I think you see some really innovative stuff. All right, and so if there's one thing you could do, you could have one way for community members to be involved in decision making. So here are some common ways. You could organize an advisory board. Are there people within your community that want to help advise what you're doing? You could host an online community meeting. You could do it like just once a year. Just hey, everybody who wants to be a part of this. What do you guys think about this? So this is what we're doing. You could organize a workshop. I know probably all of us here, we do a lot of workshops. So a workshop's great if you have sort of one discrete decision you want to make. And you could do this within a couple of days and make a decision about it. That would be a great place to do it. You can also, an easy way is you just post on social media and say, hey guys, what do you think about this? We just created this new thing, this new feature. What do you think about this? And then importantly, be sure to document what decisions are made and then also who contributed to making them, because it's easy to forget the decisions. And that's a terrible thing. If you've gone to all this effort to get the community involved in making your decision, then you forget what the decision was and you go ahead and make whatever decision you wanted to. Like that is a way to just make people feel like they have not been heard. All right, so this is my last question for you all before we go into just general discussion and questions. So what is one community engagement action you think you would like to try? It doesn't even have to be anything that I've shared here, but just like one thing. And I'll pose that also to whoever is online. If anybody feels, you have wonderful. Thanks, John.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to need to turn it on.
I guess I'm going to answer a question with maybe a question. The one that I want to try is the one that might be the most impactful. So what might that be? And, I asked that from a lot of great guidance here. And if we had full-time community managers for some of our projects, I'm sure we would have much more success at our community building activities. But we tend to have projects where somebody, as part of their role, takes on community engagement, and they have a limited amount of limited bandwidth for doing that. So I guess for efforts that have minimum cycles for community engagement, what are the what would be how would you prioritize?
Okay, that's a great question. So I think that I would probably choose the getting to know your audience piece, of going to a conference and asking people about their use and what they do, learning about them, and also learning about the way that they practice things. I would probably try to define better the audiences that I'm targeting. So if I am targeting, say, users, data users, or maybe users who could potentially be using my platform, or maybe developers, I would be trying to find those people and asking them questions. And today, this morning we had a conversation about collecting some of this information with the Cooler project. And theirs was a really simple solution. It was basically a couple of students were going to put up a poster at the student union with a question, and the question was, I think, how is climate change impacting your life? Something like that. And they're going to have some sticky notes, and students were just going to put up sticky notes. So that's like a really pretty low hanging fruit of how you could get to know your audience. Yes, thank you.
So I have a follow-up question, and I think getting to know your audience, I think, is super important for us. But how do you segment it? I was even thinking about your soil database example, right? You may have modelers that use it, or you may have AI users, and they have very different maybe profiles on. And so, how granular are you going? What is your approach for these things?
For
Kind of segmenting, right?
them, yeah.
I mean, because your data users is a pretty broad segment.
Yes.
And again, let's say, it just came to my mind, you have an AI user base and maybe the traditional modeling user base. They may have very different approaches how they want to use your data, or even how they want you to present your data, right? So how do you go about that?
Yeah, great question too. Yes, and I would typically think about their motivation. So I would think about, what is my specific project and what would I like to achieve in my project. So if my project, and I'll bring up, let's talk about Cooler, because that's a little bit different than, like OpenDOT, for example. So Cooler is a climate action project. It's connecting geosciences with the broader public. And thinking about, so they're thinking about like stakeholders like industry, they're thinking about academics, they're thinking about students, they're thinking about nonprofits, they're all really different. And the goal is to really connect and become a learning network. So with that, what do I want all of these different groups to do? How do I want my project to be impacted by their participation? And what is it that would motivate them? Like, what would motivate an academic, versus motivating an industry is a really different thing. And so I would usually draw the lines between motivation. What is an AI researcher? What are they most interested in versus maybe an in situ researcher who's going out there and collecting soil samples? They have really different needs. So that's where I would try to get an idea of why would someone want to take their valuable time to participate in my project? That's where I would try to separate those out. So I'm going to go ahead and, do you want to go ahead?
I was just going to say, I'll go through your impromptu survey of people with posters, probably at the AMS meeting. I've done that at AGU some, but not too strategically. So just like, where did you get your data? Oh, how would you make that plot? And I don't think they get that question usually from the science group that's around there. So it's kind of interesting to see that. And then I'd like to explore the discourse forums a bit more that are open, which we don't necessarily have here. We have a lot of help desk capabilities, but it'd be nice to have some more of a community capability where we can engage the community that way.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and what I love about discourse, so it's a forum basically. It's like where, it's online, people can like post a question and then someone else could answer it. What's really nice there is that really leverages the community to help so that you don't have to answer those questions. For example, there's so much knowledge and skill set within our own community. Why do you have to be the person who's like, I'm the expert, I know everything, I'll answer all the questions? It's a great way to have the community help each other so that maybe they'll get a better answer than what you could provide for them. So that's a great place, I think, to and a lot of these groups that I mentioned here are using discourse. All right, so I'm going to look through some of these online the online responses. So Caitlin says, diagram existing engagement and discuss strategies so we can collaboratively better understand and engage with our community and prioritize. Great, thank you. Yorit, my collaborators are all over the world and I collaborate mostly virtually. I'd like to make an effort to connect to peers in Minneapolis, perhaps even St. Paul. And this is a great example, I think, of sort of branching out to different audiences. So maybe Yorit has in mind that that's an audience group that he would like to get more involved in, and that's why he's targeting that group. Julia, narrowing the scope of our events so we have better defined community needs. Yes, definitely. And then speaking to your question about like the different sub-audiences, that if you're doing a hackathon, that's not going to be a good fit for maybe another less data-oriented or developer-oriented community. So And also terminology matters too. It took me a little while to figure out what is a hackathon exactly? What are the basic principles of that? And why would that, could you apply that to other types of groups? So thinking about, what are the types of events that people might expect versus, of what that's kind of common terminology of when we go to this event, that's what we do. Like workshops, for example, in science is something we love to do, workshops. And tabling is one, that's a little bit more in the public sphere. That's also really impactful, doing tabling at different events in the broader public. So let's see, coordinate, Daniel says coordinate collection of and dissemination of success stories. Yes, that's a great example of showing what, basically documenting and sharing what people have contributed, basically. So making people feel like they're heard. Be more intentional about keeping in touch with non-vocal folks. A digital version of a retreat. That's right. Retreats are another great event that people will use for community engagement. User experience, research panel. Make a mailing list for each workshop we host and keep it going, but not too many emails. Yes, great. And I mean, workshops, especially virtual, the virtual world is a really easy way to keep in touch with people because you get everybody's email. Like, I don't have your email addresses, but Tasha's got all, maybe she's, she can get the ones that of online participants. So that's a really easy way to be able to just kind of create this critical mass around your community. So I think that might be, is that it? Yep. Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm just going to wrap up just my presentation. There's not actually, I think that's pretty much the end. And I'm just going to open it up so this is a way to keep in touch with me. Here's also where I'm showing like how you can stay in touch with me by LinkedIn. I have a mailing list too. We've got a book coming out for community stewards. And let me just mention also what community stewards are, because I heard John, for example, you mentioned it about community managers, that I'm sharing all of these different actions that you can do, but you do need to have one person who is sort of the community manager. And whether or not that's John, who holds many different hats, and you also do the community management, you pick one thing that you do need to have one person typically who is just keeping an eye on it. Otherwise, because I think that community management has to be a very consistent path. So if you're making a promise to a community around a project you're doing, they don't want to see you disappear. If they're putting effort into your project and you just disappear 6 months later, it can make people feel like it wasn't a very impactful experience for them. So having someone who's just keeping an eye on things and keeping things going, making sure if you promise something, you're going to do that thing. We have a workshop coming up next 6 months from now in the summer. We'd love to have you there. Well, then that's something you should follow up on. Just being careful, just keeping that kind of consistent growth going. If your project's going to end, just explore that. Communicate that as well. So, but basically, my main point here is that a lot of these things here, these actions that I'm talking about, will require at least one person in the group. And so that's one advice to you all as you create a project. Many projects, when I see NSF proposals, for example, because I've reviewed NSF proposals around, most NSF, when I read these NSF calls, they always include community to some degree. And when usually proposals will often say, we're going to do workshops, we're going to build this community, but they don't often say how they're going to do it. And anybody who does community building knows how difficult it is. So if someone just saying, oh, we're going to, build this community, and then, a year from now we'll have these standards and we'll be able to share, it's like that. Having a much more strategic approach to it, I think, is something that projects could all use. And so if you're writing your next proposal, say, who is the community manager going to be? Who's going to manage these relationships and make sure that this project is going to consistently follow up on their promises to the community? So I'm going to end there. Thank you so much for listening and for the invitation here. And I think we have time for questions. It looks like we have maybe 10 minutes. If anybody wants to ask questions, and also people online. Oh, we have questions. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go through some of these questions.
If anybody has any questions here, just let me know. I'll get you the microphone.
Great. Should I just go ahead and
start with those.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. Let's see. Thank you for the talk. This helps me understand the structure and give a structure to community engagement. What are your thoughts on user experience research and techniques from the UX field in general with the context? Okay. Yeah. So I have some background in UX, so thankfully, so I can answer this question. user experience research is really, a lot of my background is in social science, and user experience research is basically social science. It's trying to understand people's behavior and their perceptions around a platform, usually an online platform. And one of the things I think that I really like is the user persona. So this speaks to that audience, your question about the audience. So if you can think about like who would be, and one way you can approach this. So if you're thinking about like AI researchers, you could also think about them, just kind of personify them. So here's an AI user. You might even think of someone you know. You might think of someone you talked to at a conference. And then think about what their story might be. You could also collect a story from somebody. Use cases are another really great way to approach this. So if you can collect use cases, because one thing I found in working in the data world is that it sounds very vague for people who are outside of it. People will explain, this is what our software does. This is what our platform does. This is why you need it. But from not being from that field, I cannot understand what it is that they do. And so what can really help is if you have a story. Like, here's a researcher. They went and they used the Open Dot protocol by doing these things, and they answered their question. They came in with this question. Here's how they used our platform to answer it. Those sorts of things can be really helpful. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next question. So do you have thoughts on code of conducts, moderation, what stage? Yes, I'm a really big believer in code of conducts. I read them all. If I ever have, join a conference and they say, read our code of conduct, I always read it in great detail, because you can really tell a lot about an organization and how thoughtful they have been about it. If it looks very cookie cutter, like they've copied and pasted it, then it's like that, okay, they've really not maybe even challenged themselves and had to dealt with this. Maybe they just like send it off to a third party to deal with. So codes of conduct, I really believe that code of conduct, every community should have one. Not from the start. I'd probably say as a community is maturing and you start to have a pretty good sense of what your mission is and what this community does together. If we have 2 conferences a year, we all get together and do this thing. That means you're going to have a code of conduct. You're probably going to have to be aware of kind of place-based types of things. You go to a meeting in person, what should you do and not do? And most importantly, what's the process for if you do have some sort of a conflict, what do you do? So I would say sort of after you're not initially in a community, you might want to say it sort of maybe imply it. Sometimes people do it at the beginning of an event. They might say like, everybody should, raise your hand when you want to speak. When you finish speaking, I've heard people say things like, when you're finished speaking, say that I'm done speaking so you don't get interrupted. So you could have those little types of tips. So if you're starting off, you don't have a lot of resources, then you could do just really, basic types of code of conduct stuff like practices. What do we expect out of our community? If you do have a more mature community, I would say make sure everybody weighs in on it. Like I developed a code of conduct or I led the process for the Ronan Institute. And one thing that I'll never forget, because every time I read this word, I think about it, when they talk about the word respect. And they said, a couple people mentioned, they said, respect is a term that makes it sound like it's often said to, for example, Black women when they're trying to put them in their place. And that's how it makes me feel. That is feel like you need to respect what I'm saying. And so we actually took out the word respect because we replaced it with another word that didn't have that kind of connotation and feeling. So getting a lot of different perspectives from your community around your code of conduct, I think, is important. So let's see, next one, the issue of community engagement comes down to time constraints from community members. Yes. How can we encourage more community members to contribute, particularly in activities like writing blog posts? Yes. So this is really hard. This is when people will say things like, oh, we're just going to do citizen science. We'll get everybody to contribute stuff. It's like, well, let's see. There's specific types of contexts where people will contribute. So let's just say that. If you get an iNaturalist, for example, that's a really great example of a citizen science where it's pretty easy to get people to participate. They love it. People love taking pictures of birds and plants and animals, and they love to send it there, and they see all the animals they've collected. I do it, and I love it. My kids do it, and they love it too. So, so trying to get people to contribute kind of depends on what type of project you're doing. And it may not be that it's a good fit. Like maybe asking people to write a blog post, what's in it for them? One thing that's in it for them to writing a blog post is that you should, if they do write a blog post, you make sure that you disseminate it widely, because that's often what they want. They want to get more visibility. That's what I would want. You ask me to write a blog post, I'll write a blog post if I can talk about my stuff and people will know who I am, or maybe they're an academic, and they want to write papers or make collaborations. So think of really what's motivating them. Sharing success stories. With this one, what I would do is I've tried this. I've tried to write people emails and asking them to share their success story, and nobody answers because nobody wants to stay online. So the best way, I think, is one, you can sort of what's the word? You can bribe them. So you could, for example, AGU did this really well. I saw some tables there. They had a QR code, and you could get them to like write a testimonial. And then you could give them something really cool, like I got this really cool model research vessel, I think, that I gave to my son. Or you could just ask them directly, can I interview you? Like, do you mind? I mean, usually people, if you're in person, they will talk to you. Could you just tell me how you used OpenApp? Do you mind if I just write this, put this on a blog post? So you just interview people. People like, and one thing I've learned is that people love to talk about themselves. So if you do ask them to describe one of your successes, and they will usually really, really happy about that. And it's true. And I have this thing, I have a blog post that I wrote, I called the participation rainbow. And one of the things about that is thinking about that think about your community is very porous. So the orbit idea, right? It's very porous. There's people on the periphery. Some come closer to the core, and some go away. And trying to sort of push them into being in the core all the time is probably not going to work, because it just puts a lot of stress on your shoulders. And so I try to be a little bit more relaxed about it and just expect and assume that people will come and go from your community. So just know they might disappear, they might come back. Quite frankly, people probably have a lot better things to do than be a part of a community. That's just the fact of life. But when they're available, be happy that they're there. If they're there, just say, oh, thank you for participating in any way that you can. And so I think kind of letting go. So maybe part of this is sort of letting go of I must get people to contribute, and then trying different types of strategies. And often in person can really work. How to sustain community engagement during funding gaps. So this question, so this is probably around resources. And this is a tough one. One is that volunteer mechanism, like if you have a thing like Discourse and people can just talk to each other. You don't need to be the middle person there. You can just let people just do what, just kind of engage on their own. So while you're in a funding period, you're flush, try to build those structures that allow people to engage without you being there. So get your Discourse set up, get people using it, get people used to it, put on your website and put a little thing there with a link that says, go here. This is where you can get answers from your other community members. And then just get that set up so that when you are broke, you can stop. And come back to it later, and you know that thing is still going. If you can partner with people, so other people might want to run community meetings. They might be able to, giving presentations is a much more heavy lift, but if other groups can sort of run the meetings that you would like to piggyback off of, then you can try that, like maybe just host one of the Pangeo meetings. You could just give a little presentation there instead of hosting your own. All right, so let's see, I probably got one more minute. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna take the last one because I was reading. Sorry, Yort. Except for Telegram, none of the platforms that Arika mentioned are open. Neither is Slido. How would the community engagement change for communities with values incompatible with such platforms? Let's see, that is a good question. And I guess it kind of depends. So I said earlier, for example, to use the platforms that everybody else does, but there's a flip side to that, right? Is that you're always sort of using these commercialized platforms because everybody's using them. So, and we did try, for example, in the Ronin Institute, we made a big push towards using more open source platforms. For example, not using Zoom and using Jitsi, I think was one, and trying to use some of these other types of more open platforms. And even though there was a pretty big open science community within the Ronin Institute, I'd have to say that our experience was not really that. It was not as successful as I would have liked it to be. One, because the platforms didn't always work as well as we would hoped. And another one is sometimes it will require a lot of sort of technical knowledge that we didn't have, that people weren't available to really upkeep. But I would say there were some people who were like, I'm not going to use Slack. I will not participate there because that doesn't align with my values. So they would find other ways to participate. So maybe my answer to that is have a lot of diverse ways for people to participate. Emails, like I'll usually do things like emails. Everybody does emails. Some people will do Slack, so do a little bit of Slack. Some people do social media, do some social, and just have a diversity of ways for people to engage. And then also you might want to do things like where are you going to write things? I usually will have sort of like ways that people engage together at the same time, and then have ways that people can do it asynchronously, like on a document, for example. All right, so I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your questions.
All right, let's thank Arika again. And thanks everybody for attending today.